Welcome to another video by the Geo Scholar. And as you can tell by the title, this is going to be about hundreds of bridges that were closed in the state of Mississippi. And this is a very important topic because this thing could happen anywhere in America or anywhere in the world. Because one of the things you have to understand, transportation is heavily linked to geography. I mean, there's a reason we have bridges. We have bridges because we have to cross things like rivers and lakes. It's very important to have those bridges. Take, for instance, a city like Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is called the city of bridges. Pittsburgh being a city on three rivers, you need those bridges to get things back and forth through there. And there's a video, I think there is a video on that, and but one thing about what's happening in Mississippi, about 500 bridges have been closed in the state of Mississippi. And a lot of those bridges have been closed around, hello, Arian Drake. A lot of those bridges have been closed around the Mississippi Delta region. To show, I don't have a very, I gotta, yeah. Well, I'll just refer to my map back here. At the Mississippi Delta region right here, I will flip this. That part of Mississippi right there that I got my finger on, that area right there, this area of western Mississippi right here, that is the Mississippi Delta region. The actual delta of the Mississippi River is down here, but this is the Mississippi alluvial plain, also known as, it's called the Mississippi Delta, but yeah, I'll bring that up soon. Now, what I'm going to mention about this, Mississippi is actually one of the poorest, or rather the poorest state in the United States of America. And the Mississippi Delta is the poorest region, one of the poorest regions in the United States. This is the poorest of a very poor, this is the poorest region within a very poor state. Now what I'm about to delve into, and I'm going to be somewhat short with this because I don't want to open up a can of worms. The Mississippi Delta region, it's traditionally been a very agricultural region. This is where you've had, during the antebellum times, from the time it became a state all the way up to like the 1950s, 1960s, is like the big cotton growing region of the United States of America. Before the antebellum period, it was a big area where, most of that region's wealth came from cotton and slaves. And it was like the big wealth generator because, you've got the Mississippi alluvial plain. It's very rich in fertile soil, and it's where you had a lot of cotton being grown in the United States. And this is also like basically a plantation economy developed. And that plantation economy lasted long after slavery ended. You still had the plantation way of doing things. You never really had a diversification of the economy. And after the Civil War ended, and after, Mississippi went from being a state that generated a lot of wealth, go look up Natchez, Mississippi. It went from a state that generated a lot of wealth to rapidly becoming one of the poorest regions of the United States. because it was a region that was so heavily invested in agriculture and heavily invested in the very plantation way of doing things in terms of agriculture. You look at Mississippi versus Iowa. Iowa, big corn growing state, and it's not the only crop, but it's a big crop growing there. It's like it's a little different. It's like people farm, but it's like everybody has their own little farm and things are ran differently. Whereas in Mississippi, it's a state that has it's a state that has remained poor for a long time, but the Delta region of Mississippi, the Mississippi alluvial plain, that has been like the poorest of the poor. And that's a region where a lot of people have just left. A lot of people have left. And there hasn't really been a whole lot of investment in the region, not as much as other places. But with Mississippi, one thing to understand, when you're in that region of the Mississippi River, known along, because the Mississippi River basically forms the western border of Mississippi, and you have a lot of rivers and a lot of that feed into the Mississippi River, and because of that, you have a large need for bridges to cross them. I would go look up a song called, I think it's, I forget if it's called Billy Joe McAllister or Tallahatchie Bridge. And that song, I think in many ways it's sort of like Mississippi having so many bridges, and because you need them, because you have a lot of rivers in that state. And with a lot of the rivers in that state, the need for the, because without those rivers, you can't, here's the thing. Rivers, if they are large enough, deep enough, and wide enough, they are very helpful for the transportation of goods via the water. But if your river is too shallow, or if your river tends to collect a lot of sandbars, you're going to have a problem. The river becomes redundant if a river tends to have a lot of sandbars in it, or if a river is too shallow, it's redundant. And so in many cases, rather than that particular river being an asset, it becomes a liability for you. The Mississippi River is an asset because it's deep enough to carry things like barges. But then you have some rivers that don't have the capacity to carry barges. And so you have to consider, this is why you need bridges, because you need to shorten the distance between one place and another, separated by water. But then with a lot of the bridges that have been built, you have a situation where the infrastructure is crumbling and the bridges are old because historically this has been a very poor state, and there's not been a lot of money to go fix the infrastructure. And trying to fix the infrastructure, you see, it costs a lot of money to fix that infrastructure. So instead, in many cases, they're just closing the bridges down instead. They're closing them down, getting rid of it. They're like, you cannot cross this bridge closed, for obvious reasons, because, it's going to be a problem if you try to cross the bridge. And with that being a problem, it's going to cause some bigger problems, both to people and to economies. Consider this. With Mississippi being kind of the Mississippi River Delta the Mississippi Delta region is not only a very poor region, there are many people in the region that have health problems like diabetes, heart disease, and there are many people, they need access to medical care. And one of the big problems is how to get emergency services out there. Because if you if you get sick out there, if you get sick, and then some, how's the emergency services going to get to you if they can't get across the bridge? Or how are you going to get to an emergency service if you can't travel? Or if you're traveling, the way of getting to an emergency service is really, really difficult. How is that going to take place? Because many people are having to find longer ways to get to places. And one of the most important things to consider, time is a very finite resource. And understanding time and understanding spatial distance, you must understand that with that, there's a certain amount of time that you might have to reach a place. If somebody gets sick or has a heart attack or something, you got to get them to a hospital or get them somewhere as quickly as you can, and those minutes count. It's like, the more time wasted, there is a good chance somebody won't live, somebody might die before they reach the hospital. Or they might reach the hospital, but the time that was needed to get them help, so much time passed that by the time they get them to the hospital, there's not much the doctors can do. Said person could end up dead on arrival at the hospital, or if they're not dead on arrival at the hospital, they might die at the hospital because they couldn't get to the hospital fast enough. And that's something that has to be really, really well understood about what that could do. In many cases, you got people who have to get their medication. It's not so much they have to go to the hospital, but they just got to get some medication. And it gets harder for them to get things like medication, get things like, their pills or their insulin, because, the bridge they would normally take to get to a certain place, they can't take it because it's closed. And because it's closed, you're in a bad spot. You're in very bad shape. You have to take the long way, or you got cases where people have had, they try to drive through a certain place and then boom, their car's stuck and their car could get flooded somehow. And then you have to take into consideration there are a lot of soybean farmers in Mississippi, and there's still some cotton being grown in Mississippi. And I think, and one of the major reasons, and as a side note, one of the major reasons why unemployment rates went up, and one of the reasons why there was a big exodus from the region, there were political reasons why there was an exodus from the Mississippi Delta, namely Jim Crow, Cleveland, Detroit. Went offline, I'm back. But as I mentioned, the region that Mississippi has just, it's a region it's a state that's been poorer than any other state. And one of the things like with the infrastructure, and one reason infrastructure is important, transportation. You have to understand how important transportation really is. When you think about transportation geography, you have to think about the space in which a product has to travel, in which people have to travel, and you have to think about the barriers to travel. Land barriers can be a very big part to travel. And in the case of Mississippi, rivers, water is a big factor here. We're talking about a region that's basically, it's like the bottomlands near the river. And you have a lot of other rivers flowing into the Mississippi River. Some are usable for watercraft, but for the most part, you have to think about a lot of rivers. there are many rivers that are assets in terms of transportation and many that are not. And when you have a place where you need to be able to cross a place, you need to be able to get to the other side really quickly, and you need those bridges because it cuts off some time. It'll save some time. And one of the big things about commerce and about geography and about transportation, time is key. Time is more valuable than money, especially when you are transporting goods. And this is where geography is a factor. You have to think about the barriers to travel. You have to think about some of the farmers who have to transport their goods to the market. And they have to transport it to, processing factories. You have to think about how much time that takes and the barriers to travel and just the time and the distance decay. You have to think about all of that. And then you have to think about why those bridges closing are going to present a major economic problem, because with those bridges being closed, this will really hurt farmers in Mississippi because you need those bridges to transport your goods. And if you don't have those bridges open to transport your goods, you're going to have to find another way somehow to get your goods out to market. And the time is going to be wasted. And then with that time being wasted, your money is going to be wasted. And this is why time is more valuable than money. Because in many cases, this is the thing, you can make money. But if time's being wasted, if you have a time decay, you're going to have a problem making money. Because in this particular case, it could get really it could get really expensive just to transport goods. You're going to be spending more money, more gasoline money trying to find ways to transport, and it could cause a big problem for farmers. In many cases, some farmers might give up. But it shows you the importance of just infrastructure and transportation and the human environmental interactions. We're talking about place, we're talking about human environmental interactions, we're talking about transportation, we're talking, just how a lot of this comes together in geography, economic geography, transportation geography, medical and human geography. And I'm ending my stream here. If you like this stream, check out other videos on my channel. If you want to donate to the channel, want to support the channel, I have a link in the description box to the Patreon. Great topic. Yes, thank you. I have the link to the Patreon. Click on that link. And as always, be sure to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. And a special thanks to all the Patreons who have supported this far. And till next time, this is the Geo Scholar, signing off.